Hello YouTube, this is MK Vine once again, and I will be making a video giving some of my final thoughts on my discussion with Ozzy on the sacrifice of Jesus. First of all, I want to thank Ozzy for having this dialogue with me, and I would also like to thank him for at least acknowledging that Catholics do not take the same view that Zia Ahmed's video refutes. Now, from what I've heard in your video, you seem to acknowledge the possibility of there being a teaching in Judaism about the death of the righteous atoning, and you said that you do not deny this position. You say that this may or may not have been a part of mainstream Judaism. However, the way you implied in your video, you made it seem like it was not a part of mainstream Judaism because all the websites that you provided do not mention this concept. Again, I will say with all due respect, arguing from silence will not prove your point. Just because these websites do not mention it does not in any way refute my claims. I did provide sources such as Orthodox Jewish historian Rabbi Beryl Wayne, Rashi's commentary, rabbinic scholar Solomon Schletzter, world-renowned specialist in early Jewish traditions Giza Vermes, also Jacob Milgram, one of the foremost experts on the biblical system of atonement. I also provided the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, the Midrash, and other sources that agree with my position. In order to refute these claims, you need to provide me with scholars or sources that say otherwise, and not just say that it is not mentioned. In that regards, you cannot assume that this is not part of mainstream Judaism. You did question where I got my sources. Actually, I did some personal study and I read some books. I did provide the references to these sources. It's there for anyone who's willing to look into it or anyone who's interested. You might have to go to a library to check this out, or you might have to ask a Jewish friend to help you out on this, or just go about it through other means. These sources may or may not be online. I'm not sure since I did not gather my information from online sources, but if I do find it, I will be more than happy to send you a message and give you the online links. You then say that Christians are introducing things that are not part of rabbinic tradition. First of all, as you well know, I am not speaking on behalf of other Christians, but I will speak on my behalf. I did provide sources that are part of rabbinic tradition, and that's exactly why I cited all these rabbinic sources. Again, I did some personal study, and I did not use online sources for my assertions, so I apologize for not giving you the links. But again, if I do find them, I will gladly send them to you. Also, you mentioned that you talked to Jews about this subject and that they agree with your position. Well, the thing is, I also talked to Jews about this, and they also agreed with my position, even though some of them do not regard Jesus as the Messiah. But nevertheless, they agreed with the concept that I asserted. However, we cannot put too much weight into these people's opinions simply because they are not scholars, so that approach is questionable. Also, well, this is not true for all Jews. You also have to take into consideration that some Jews may have a bias towards Christians. But as you well know, I did provide not only scholars but examples from the Tanakh itself, and you haven't really addressed these points other than to say maybe it's not part of mainstream Judaism, and you did not even prove that point. About the strawman argument, you said that I said that Zia Ahmed's points are strawman, then I would also need to say that the rabbi's arguments are strawman. However, I can easily turn the tables around. I can say that if my arguments are strawman, then the Orthodox Jewish scholars, the Jewish historians, the Tanakh, Rashi, and all the other sources I mentioned are also strawman. You see, we have to understand what the main issue is here. The main issue is whether Jesus' death had to be carried out in the same way as an animal sacrifice. You pointed out that the websites you mentioned said that Jesus did not fit the criteria for animal sacrifice because he was not killed in the same way as an animal sacrifice. Actually, I agree with this. Jesus did not fulfill the criteria for being sacrificed in the same way as an animal simply because he wasn't an animal. Sacrificial laws do not apply to humans. Humans can only typify or prefigure those sacrifices. Here is the thing. If Jesus was a righteous person, then his death did not have to be carried out in the same way as an animal sacrifice. and that's why I gave examples of other righteous people whose death atoned for sin, and their death was a direct link to animal sacrifices. In regards to Miriam's death, you said that the difference between her death and Jesus' death mentioned in Hebrews 10 was that Jesus' death was the last and final act of atonement, while Miriam's death was only for that time, for that short period of time, and that sacrificial atonement continued after that. However, in Catholicism, every Sunday at Mass, the priest re-represents the sacrifice of Christ through the Eucharist, and this is to be done until the second coming of Christ. Also, I do not think your comparison of Miriam and Jesus is a valid one, simply because Miriam was not God incarnate, whereas Christians believe that Jesus was God incarnate. And as I mentioned to you in the comments section, this point that you brought up is basically just getting off topic, and I say this with all due respect. I will be happy to discuss this issue as a separate topic, but let's go back to the original point. The original point brought forth by Zia Ahmed was that Jesus' death was a direct link to animal sacrifice, and therefore Jesus had to be killed in the same way as an animal sacrifice. He even gave examples that he had to die in the temple, he had to be offered up by a priest, his blood had to be sprinkled on the altar, etc. What I was addressing was that just because there is a direct link to animal sacrifice does not mean that you have to die like an animal sacrifice. That's why I mentioned the death of a righteous person. I gave examples of righteous people whose death had a direct link to animal sacrifices, and yet they were not killed like an animal sacrifice. They did not chew cud, they did not have their hooves split, their blood wasn't sprinkled on the altar, etc. The question is, why were their deaths mentioned as a direct link to animal sacrifice? The answer is to teach that their death only prefigured or typified that of animal sacrifice, and that just as the death of just as an animal sacrifice brought atonement, so also the death of the righteous brought atonement. In Jesus' case, as Christians, we believe that he was a righteous person who was killed. So, as a righteous person, his death had atoning power. In addition, his death is mentioned as a direct link to animal sacrifice. Again, this is to teach that his death only prefigured or typified animal sacrifice, and it's also to teach that just as animal sacrifice has atoning power, so also Jesus' death had atoning power. That's basically what the topic is. Again, if you want to discuss the quantity and the effects of each atonement brought, I'll be happy to discuss that in a separate video, but for this video, the topic is different. You also mentioned that Christians often say that Jesus' death is the same as an animal sacrifice. The problem I see here is that you have to define what you mean by quote-unquote the same as. If you take it to mean that Jesus' death had to be carried out according to sacrificial laws, then I can see your point. However, if what you mean by the same is that Jesus' death had the same effect of an animal sacrifice, meaning that it had atoning power, and that his death prefigured that of animal sacrifice, then that's a whole other issue which I dealt with already in my discussion with you. Again, I am not speaking on behalf of other Christians, I'm speaking from a Catholic perspective, and I thank you for acknowledging that. I will agree with you, however, that there are some Christian denominations who have an unorthodox view of the death of Christ, and I would actually side with and applaud you and Zia Ahmed in this regard. So this will conclude my video. Thank you, Ozzy, for the dialogue. We may have to agree to disagree on this one, but I enjoyed this nevertheless, and thank you everyone for watching.